Okay, so now we're going to look at creation myths around the world. And so I'm actually going to switch over to a different PowerPoint here. So previously we looked at, now we've looked at the creation myths of the Americas, and we looked at the creation myth of the Greeks in the form of the writing of Hesiod. And so what I want to do is look at sort of what these different myths might have in common or not. And just give a little sampling of the different kind of creation myths that you can look at. Because one of our things in this course will be for you guys to do that mini paper, and the mini paper will involve um, basically you pick a creation myth of your own to research in more depth. So for that, I want to give you kind of a taste of the available options here. So I think we talked a little bit about how there's the Hurrian creation myth, which is kind of similar to the Greeks. So again, we have that idea of, um, you know, the body parts being very important, and biting and eating, and these sort of male pregnancies, as in almost kind of what Kronos does with swallowing these children. And again, we have that same sort of thing going on with Kumarbi, the god of the sky. Kumarbi eats his father's private parts. That's pretty wild. And it allows him to have this male pregnancy and give birth to a storm god who is very similar to Zeus. He is the hero, he is the king of the gods, he slays monsters. That's a very Zeus type of thing. And, you know, I believe he has lightning bolts as well. So possibly a connection there to the Greek creation myth, or possibly they you know, there's different possibilities. They could have originated from the same source and spread out over time, or they could have encountered each other and become more similar over time. Maybe a little bit of both, honestly. And there's some obscure Greek myths where a similar sort of thing happens with Zeus. Zeus also does that sort of father castration type of stuff, in addition to Kronos doing it to Uranos. So we talked about this as an idea of fertility, like who controls the fertility? That seems to be one of the core concepts in the Greek and the Hurrian context. I also want to mention, you know, I alluded to the different ages of man, the ages story of the Golden Age and the Silver Age and whatnot, as being kind of similar to the idea of the Aztecs with creating and destroying the world. We'll also look at some destruction myths later on. But I want to point out specifically one that has a lot of parallels with what the Greeks are talking about. And this is not quite a creation myth per se, but it has that same idea of gold and silver and destruction. So this is the vision of Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar was a part of Mesopotamian culture. This is kind of the area to the east here we think of as the Middle East, kind of around here, what's now Iraq. But this was an area that had a lot of cultural contact and at times took over the homeland of the Jews over here, or the Hebrews. So the Jews slash Hebrews, we'll talk about more about their creation myth in the book of Genesis next time. But at one point, they had told a story that seems an awful lot like Hesiod's Golden Age idea. So the idea is that Nebuchadnezzar, who was a Babylonian king, had a vision, and a Jewish prophet interpreted it for him. So in Nebuchadnezzar's vision, there was a statue, and the statue had a golden head, a silver torso, a bronze lower body, feet that were a mixture of iron and clay, and then finally a rock came down and smashed the statue. And the Jews interpreted this vision for him as being about God and saying, and about his own kingdom, that there would be different kingdoms in the future. So that basically the way this myth was interpreted was, you are the king of the Golden Age, and later there will come along a kingdom that is almost but not quite as good as yours, and this will be the Silver Age. And then there will be a kingdom of bronze, and then a kingdom of iron, and then finally you get to the feet of clay slash iron. And the stone that's going to come along and smash the statue is the kingdom of the Jews, which will be the final kingdom, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to the end, but it will in itself endure forever. So I just think that's kind of cool that there's something that seems kind of similar to this idea of the different ages. Only now it's interpreted as a prophecy for the future instead of a vision for the past. Now, some scholars think that it was prophecy that was written looking back, put into the context as if it was a prediction of the future, but written with the knowledge that there would be different kingdoms that would take over the area and rise and fall. Some people have interpreted the Roman Empire as one of these kingdoms. Some people would interpret America as one of these kingdoms. It all depends on how you want to interpret the vision. But the idea that things started off good and then they became worse is kind of the idea here, just as it is for Hesiod. And then the answer, though, is that God will come and will finally make things better again. So I think that's kind of interesting, and kind of fits with these sort of creation destruction patterns that we're seeing. But let's put a pin in that, and then we'll get back to these creation destruction ideas in a second here. But let's get back to things that are sort of just pure creation here. So the Japanese creation myth is a fun one. In the beginning, the world was a swirling ocean of mist. It was all sort of cloudy mist. And the first man and the first woman were born from the mist. And so they basically took a spear and they churned the mist like they were churning butter. And they sort of caused it to congeal. And then they congealed into the islands of Japan, which are, of course, naturally in this story, the most important place to be. Just as every story says that it's the most important place to be. So they created the islands of Japan, and then they began to live on the islands of Japan and built their own sort of house there, their pavilion of heaven. And they had children. Izanami, the first woman, began to give birth to the gods, but unfortunately she was killed when she gave birth to fire. Fire was a god who just burned her all up, and it was very tragic. And so she was killed. But Izanagi decided to go find her. He looked for her in the land of the dead. He went and he found her there, and he heard her voice in the darkness, and she said, "Don't look at me." And he said, "Why? What's wrong?" And he used a torch to look at her, even though he was told not to, right? You always got to disobey when you're given a commandment like that in these stories. That's just what makes the stories fun. And it turned out she had become a rotting corpse. She had become a sort of monstrous figure full of worms, crawling in and out of her body. And so she had been transformed by her death into the goddess of the dead. And so she now ruled over the land of the dead. And he fled, and he became the god of the living world, and she became the god of the world of the dead. And so the world of the dead is a scary place. And that's a theme we're going to touch on later on, too. And from this strange encounter, he got dirt in his eyes and his nose. And from one nostril, he created the sun from the dirt when he wiped the dirt away. And from the other, he created the moon god. And then he created the storm god as well. No, actually, I think it was the two eyes, and then his nose was the storm god. And these were very important gods in the Japanese tradition, including Amaterasu, the sun goddess, who is said to be the descendant of the Japanese emperors. Now, if we go over and we look at the creation myth in Norse mythology, we see maybe some similar themes. In the beginning, the world was a void. The void was called Gigunagap. It's a gap, kind of like chaos originally means gap or void. But there were sort of streams of hot and cold. There was the heat kind of the world of fire, and there was the cold of the world of ice. And they congealed. And where they met, they sort of congealed into the body of a sleeping giant. And the giant's name was Ymir. And Ymir was lying there asleep, and his sweat came from him, and it turned into a cow. The sweat congealed as well, and it became a cow. And the cow was named Adumla, and the cow nourished him with milk. So while he was sleeping, he just drank milk from this cow. It's kind of funny because it feels like an explanation for something, but it also doesn't really explain anything, right? Here we can see the milk streaming from the cow. But you got to imagine people were telling the story, and then someone said, well, how did Ymir survive? What did he eat? How did he survive while he was asleep there for however long? And they decided, there was a giant cow. And, it's pretty funny how these kinds of ideas come about. But then the cow turned out to be pretty important too. The cow licked a block of ice, as cows will do. They'll lick things. And that turned into another sort of giant being called Buri. From Ymir's body sort of generated giants. So giants were spawned from his body. Meanwhile, from Buri's body were basically the first gods, known as the Aesir. And so the Aesir are sort of the heroes and protagonists of Norse mythology and the gods that people worship. And they have this long rivalry with the giants, or maybe more accurately known as the Jotun, this other race of beings. And so Ymir kind of gives birth to the enemies or sort of, villain-ish figures of this mythology, and Buri gives birth to the hero figures of the mythology. And then the gods chopped Ymir up into pieces, and they made the world out of his body. That's pretty weird. But that's a theme we'll see in some other myths as well, is the idea of making the world out of somebody's body. And yeah, in a second I'll talk about why I think that is. That we see this idea of chopping somebody up, but it's a surprisingly common thing. Some other ones in the Egyptian mythology, creation myth, the world began as like a sea of muddy water. And from the muddy water, eventually a mound of earth kind of congealed, and it emerged out of the water. And this was good soil where you could grow things. And this mound of earth became the world as we know it today, surrounded by water, influenced and shaped by water, but with this solid place to stand in the middle of it all. And you got to think that this was probably influenced by the Nile River, which is very important in ancient Egyptian culture. And then eventually the sun god, sometimes Ra, sometimes Khepri, emerged from the mound. And from him descended all the other gods, including the earth god and the earth god and the sky goddess Geb and Nut, who had to be separated just like Uranos and Gaia did. And then the other gods were descended from them. And the gods shaped the mound, and eventually they shaped it into civilization and taught people how to do all the things like grow food and things like that. So that's sort of the basics of the Egyptian creation myth. So maybe we're noticing some patterns here. We start off with something that is very vague and unformed, and then it congeals into a shape. And we kind of start off with everything being one originally, and then it takes on other forms. Here's Nut and Geb one more time, having to be separated by their children so that the world can exist, so that there's actually space for people to be in. And it's not super consistent from like a actual logistics point of view, but that's the thing about myths, right, is that they very rarely have to have logistics. It's only if someone sort of, asks that they go into detail like that. They're more sort of abstract and working on almost a symbolic level. In the Hindu world, in India, you see a lot of interesting abstract kind of creation myths as well. There are a lot of ideas that come from many different perspectives about the creation of the world. One of them is the idea of the cosmic egg. And this is something we also see in other traditions as well, including some more mystical Greek traditions. The idea that the world was an egg and then it hatched. And one version of the Hindu creation myth, the yolk of the egg became the sun, the white of the egg became the moon, and then the rest of the world hatched out of it. But another thing we see in the Hindu creation myth is almost like a psychological, philosophical attempt to tell a similar sort of story. And this is, Hinduism has always had a very introspective mythology, thinking about the nature of the gods and the nature of existence and, the nature of souls as all being part of some one unified thing. So they kind of describe a time when there was neither existence nor non-existence. There was no air, no space, no death, no immortality. There was just nothing in the sets of concepts that we have today. And then suddenly there was a one that came to be out of the quote, the cosmic water, the dark cosmic water. And the one that came to be arose at last, born out of the power of heat. And the one began to have desire. And eventually, as the story goes on, the one becomes lonely and splits into two beings. And then from there, the two beings pursue each other and beget all the children who are the gods and the modern people. And one more concept that we see in Hinduism and other related traditions is the idea of the world being created and destroyed basically forever. the world goes through a cycle where it improves and gets really good, and then it sort of reaches a peak and then gets terrible again and it's destroyed. And then it's created again and then it's really good and then goes through a peak and then it's destroyed again. And we just go around in a cycle of happiness versus sadness. People get taller as things are getting better. People get shorter and more evil as things are getting worse. And the cycle is known as a kalpa. Kalpa would be one sort of unit of this cycle. And, the kalpas basically go on forever, according to some notions. So this reminds me a lot of the Aztec situation with, the creation and destruction of the different suns of the world, us being on the fifth sun, and a little bit of the Golden Age type stuff as well, of the kingdoms that rise and fall. Only here, it's not a strict pattern of things going down. It's sort of rise and fall, rise and fall, rise and fall. So maybe the Golden Age is just one sort of point on this circle, right? That would kind of be the idea that we'd be working with. So, think back over all of these. What are sort of the big themes that are coming out of creation myths? Do different creation myths have something in common? I think we can say that they do. It's not necessarily a super consistent thing that you would be able to identify all possible examples of it from one story, but it's more of a broad pattern where sometimes some things are around and sometimes they aren't. But you can see the pattern because these are ideas that kind of make sense and are intuitive to the human mind. And some of the things that we see in this pattern, the world starting off as some sort of chaotic thing, like an ocean or a sea of mist or a void, and then that void having to congeal into something. So we go from sort of shapelessness to shape. Another transition is we go into pairs of opposites. So we think about the egg that hatched or into, the sun and the moon, or the one that became two, the sky and the earth. If you really think about the Greek creation myth, there's a lot of opposites going on. We've got basically these pairs of male and female gods that create this pattern for a few different generations until it finally gets more complicated after that. So the process is kind of like 1 to 2 to many, or sometimes it's nothing to 1 to 2 to many. Because once you have 2, you can kind of have this primordial couple who give rise to all their descendants. And so we kind of saw that in the Navajo as well. We had the first man, the first woman, and then they have this sort of series of descendants who can create the rest of human civilization. There's also a sort of movement from things being very chaotic and kind of wild and natural to going more towards the state of things as they are in civilization. The gods often instruct people how to do things, how to do the social norms that are important for society. Fertility is usually pretty important. Sometimes we have asexual reproduction, sometimes we have sexual reproduction. When we have a duality, we usually have sexual reproduction. We have a lot of generational type of thinking, as if it's all just a family tree that goes on. Sometimes we have conflict between the different generations, and we're going to see that in some more creation myths that we look at later in this course. And there's this idea of sort of multiple tries. Maybe the gods have to take multiple tries to create the world. Maybe there's multiple worlds. But the idea is things weren't always perfect. So how do we kind of explain the world with that in mind? Well, maybe things were good, but they got worse. Or maybe the gods had to try multiple times and it was an upward trajectory to finally get it right. So there's different ways of thinking about that. And then, of course, we could just be living in a temporary time of good things, and a time of bad things could be around the corner. And there could be creation and destruction in a cycle. So there's a lot of different directions you can go with this. But I think it would be safe to say that, these are not the same myth per se, but they are riffing on similar themes. They have basically the same concerns in mind as, how does the world come to be? Why do we do the things we do as a society? How do things work? How do we explain the fact that there's something rather than nothing? Those are all the kind of themes that we're thinking about in these creation myths. And maybe that's just because creation myths have to serve a function, which is, explaining how did everything come to be? Not just a story of one thing, but all of society, all of human existence. So there's a lot of different things you'll want to talk about when you get to something like that. Okay, so hopefully that overview gives you guys some inspiration for if you want to research one of these in more depth, which one would that be? Which one would you want to research? So I'll leave you by looking at the prompt here. I just fixed this, so it wasn't showing up originally. I re-uploaded it, so guys should be able to see it now. So the creation myth writing assignment is not due until the 18th, not until after the midterm. But if you want to start thinking about it now and working on it, that would not be a bad idea. So here's how the assignment works. Basically, you pick any creation myth other than, I think, the theogony and works and days, because Hesiod we discussed in quite a lot of detail. So I would say avoid that one. But if you want to do the Dine Bahane, because we didn't go into as much detail with that, that would be totally fine. Or any of the ones I just talked about just now, if any of those sort of piqued your interest. I want to kind of open it up to, outside the ancient Greek context. But yeah, any myth is fair game. If you want to like run a suggestion by me, that would be cool. But you don't have to. So pick one. And do a little bit of research using any resources that you wish to use. So it's pretty open-ended. If you want to go to like that same website, no, well that wouldn't work because that's all Greek sources. But if you want to go to a similar website which talks about a particular set of mythology, that would be totally fine. Or if you want to, use a book from the Front Range Library. So here's what you're going to need to do in the paper. It's very short. It's going to be about 1 to 2 pages. And what you're going to need to do is give a basic summary of the myth, like what happens in the myth. Then what I want you to do is pick 2 approaches from our tools for examining myth. So you remember that list, that's the handout that you can find in the content page with like rituals was one of them, ideology was one of them. So again, just like you've been doing all throughout is like talk about these approaches and maybe talk about the functions of the myth for the society that created it. So if it's the Norse myth, like why do they have all that stuff about the cow? What do you think? Is there some sort of ritual purpose or ideological purpose, or maybe just a psychological purpose? Any of that stuff to sort of talk about any features of the myth. What insights would we learn from those approaches? So then compare this myth to other creation myths that we've looked at in class. And the main goal here is to find common themes or ideas. So what common themes or ideas does your chosen creation myth share with other creation myths? And based on that, why do you think it's fair to call this one a creation myth? What qualities does it have that make it a creation myth? And then finally, I want you to cite your sources. So list the sources that you used to get your information in a very simple kind of bibliography. Just any format is fine. MLA, Chicago, or APA is all totally fine. But just, use your resources and make sure you explain where you are getting your ideas from. Because that's how we do, history and scholarship is we want to know where people are getting your ideas from. So if someone comes up with an idea that is totally wrong, we can go back and figure out, why did they have that idea? On the other hand, if someone comes up with an idea that's totally right, we can go and look at the stuff that they looked at and, really continue to develop our own ideas. Like maybe there's a whole lot more where that idea came from. So that's kind of what scholars do, and that's what I want you guys to do. Ideally, I think it would probably be good to use at least this one source outside of the textbook, just to kind of round things out a little bit more. But if you want to use the textbook for your research, you can. There's some chapters of creation myths in the textbook that we didn't get to, and we don't have time to get to in depth. I would love to see someone tackle any of those. So that's basically the prompt. If you guys have questions about that, let me know. It's not officially due for a while, but it's good to kind of get the ball rolling already. And I think today, when we're really discussing a lot of different creation myths, is the perfect time to talk about it. And I think that's pretty much it. So I've got a discussion question about the Dine Bahane and creation myths. And so I will look forward to seeing what you guys have to say. And I will try to jump into the discussion if I can. All right, catch you later.